My dad let my mom abuse me for years. He begged me to forgive her on her deathbed, but I did this. Hello, read it. For most of my life, I believed that if I stayed quiet, if I swallowed my pain and followed the rules, things would get better. I thought that if I played the part of the good son, if I kept my head down and didn't fight back, I could survive my childhood without making things worse. But I was wrong, because silence doesn't protect you. It only makes it easier for people to hurt you. My name is Aaron, and I'm 32 years old. If you looked at me now, you'd never guess the kind of childhood I had. I have a stable job, a place of my own, a life that I built from the ground up. But the scars are still there, even if no one else can see them. They live in the way I flinch when someone raises their voice, in the way I second-guess myself when I speak, in the way I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I'm back in that house. The house where my mother ruled with an iron grip and my father stood by and watched. From the outside, we look like a normal family, maybe even a good one. My parents have been high school sweethearts, married young, built a life together. My mother, Claire, was beautiful and sharp-tongued, the kind of woman people respected but never dared to cross. My father, Tom, was quiet and passive, always standing a step behind her, nodding along to whatever she said. He was the kind of man who mistook compliance for peace, who believed that as long as he didn't make waves, everything would be fine. And I was the child caught in the crossfire. I don't know when exactly I realized that other families weren't like ours, that other kids didn't spend their childhoods walking on eggshells, waiting for the next explosion, that other mothers didn't see their children as something to control, to punish, to break. My mother was a master manipulator. She knew exactly how to twist reality, how to make you question your own memories, how to take your pain and turn it against you. She could be terrifyingly cruel one moment and warm and affectionate the next, leaving me constantly off balance, never knowing what version of her I was going to get. She called it discipline. She called it tough love. She said she was teaching me how to be a man. But I wasn't learning how to be a man. I was learning how to survive. And my father? He let it happen. I can still hear his voice in my head, the same words over and over again whenever I tried to stand up for myself, whenever I dared to ask why he never did anything to stop her. She's your mother, Aaron. Show some respect. You know how she gets? Just don't push her. She does everything for this family. The least you can do is listen to her. It didn't matter what she did to me. It didn't matter how many times she screamed in my face until I was shaking, how many times she slapped me across the mouth for talking back, how many times she made me feel like I was worthless, pathetic, a mistake. In his eyes, she was always right, and I was always the problem. For years, I told myself that if I could just hold out until I was 18, I could escape. And I did. The moment I was legally an adult, I packed my things and left. No emotional farewell, no last showdown. Just a quiet disappearance, like a ghost slipping out in the dead of night. I cut contact with him for years, built my own life far away from the house that never felt like home. And for a while it worked, but people like my parents don't just disappear. And that was how, at 32 years old, I found myself trapped in a family reunion I never wanted to attend. It had been years since I had seen them, years of distance, of freedom, of learning how to be my own person without their voices in my head. I had kept my interactions with them minimal, replying to the occasional text from my father out of obligation, ignoring my mother entirely. But when my cousin Jake reached out, telling me that the entire family was coming together for the first time in over a decade, something inside me hesitated. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the part of me that still wanted to believe that people could change. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could see them again and feel nothing. So I went. The venue was a rented hall, decorated with cheap string lights and white tablecloths, the kind of place where people threw weddings on a budget. When I walked in, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes turned to me. Some people looked surprised to see me, others uncomfortable, as if they knew exactly why I had stayed away for so long. My father was the first to greet me, his expression a careful mix of guilt and relief. My mother? She acted like no time had passed at all, like I was still a teenager under her roof, obligated to greet her with a kiss on the cheek. I gave her a polite nod and kept my distance. The night dragged on, filled with awkward small talk and forced laughter. I kept to myself, sipping my drink, watching from the sidelines as my parents performed. Because that's what they did, pretended. Pretended to be the perfect couple, pretended that our family was one big, happy unit, pretended that the past hadn't happened. I had planned to leave early, but then my father stood up to give a toast. And that was when everything went to hell. He raised his glass, smiling at my mother, and began talking about forgiveness, about loyalty, about how marriage was about weathering storms together, no matter what. And then in front of everyone, he said it. He talked about how strong my mother was, how she had made mistakes in the past, how their marriage had been tested, but that he had forgiven her. And then, in the same breath, he said that forgiving cheaters and moving forward is the mark of a real man. That holding grudges doesn't solve anything. That family is about loyalty, no matter what happens. My blood ran cold. Everyone at that table, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, they all nodded along, murmuring in agreement, acting like what he was saying was wisdom, like it was noble, like it wasn't a lie. Because I knew the truth. I knew what he was really talking about. He wasn't just talking about his marriage. He was talking about me. He was talking about what my mother had done to me. The years of abuse, the screaming, the gaslighting, the bruises that I had to hide. He was telling me in front of everyone that I was supposed to forgive her, that I was supposed to let it go, to pretend it never happened, to be a good son and move on. I felt something snap inside me. For years, I had been quiet. For years, I had swallowed my anger, convinced myself that keeping the peace was the only way to stay sane. But standing there listening to my father rewrite history in real time, I realized something. I wasn't that scared little boy anymore. And I wasn't going to be silent. I stood up. I looked my father in the eye, and I called him out in front of everyone. And that was when the real chaos began. The moment I stood up, the entire room went silent. Dozens of faces turned to me, eyes wide with confusion, some with immediate discomfort. No one had expected me to react. No one had expected me to break the unspoken rule of our family. We do not talk about what happened. We pretend. We keep the mask in place. We let the past rot behind closed doors. But I wasn't pretending anymore. I looked straight at my father, his glass still raised mid-toast, frozen in place. My mother sat beside him, her polite, picture-perfect smile twitching at the edges, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her wine glass. She knew. She knew what was coming, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't stop it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told them the truth. I said that my father wasn't a noble man for forgiving my mother. He was a coward for letting her destroy me. I said that what happened in their marriage wasn't just about him. It was about me, about the years of torment she put me through while he stood there, silent, doing nothing. I said that real forgiveness had to be earned, not demanded, and that the only reason he was giving this speech wasn't because he was a good man. It was because it was easier to rewrite history than to face the fact that he let his wife abuse his own son. A murmur rippled through the room. Some gasps, some shifting in seats, some averted gazes, as if they could pretend they weren't hearing this. My father opened his mouth, probably to tell me I was overreacting, that I was making a scene, that this wasn't the time or place. But I didn't give him the chance. I turned to my mother, who had yet to say a word, sitting stiff-backed like a statue carved out of ice. I asked her if she wanted to explain why she spent my entire childhood punishing me for existing, why she spent years telling me I was weak when I cried, that I was ungrateful when I asked why she treated me the way she did, that I was selfish when I finally left. She didn't answer, but I saw it, the flicker of something behind her eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, just rage. Not because she regretted what she had done, but because I had the audacity to say it out loud. And then she did what she always did. She laughed. That cruel, cutting laugh that had once made my stomach knot, that had once made me doubt my own memories, my own sanity. She tilted her head slightly, a smirk curling on her lips, and asked me if I was really still holding on to that. If I was seriously bringing up old wounds just to make her look bad. I felt my fingers dig into the edge of the table. She called me dramatic, said I was always too sensitive, that I had always exaggerated things, that I had made things difficult for her, that I had always been a difficult child who needed firm parenting. There it was, the rewriting of history, the attempt to twist the narrative in real time, to put me back in the role of the problem and herself in the role of the long-suffering mother who had just done her best. I could feel the room splitting into two. Some people shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between us, unsure of what to do. Others stared at their plates, pretending they weren't listening. And then there were the ones who were on her side before I had even opened my mouth. The aunts and uncles who had always whispered that I was the distant one, the ungrateful son who had abandoned his family. They were already shaking their heads, already rolling their eyes. And then my father finally spoke. He told me to sit down, that I was ruining the evening, that I was embarrassing myself. And that was when I truly snapped. I turned to him, voice steady, hands clenched at my sides. I told him that he had never protected me, that he had watched year after year as my mother humiliated me, broke me down, made me feel like I was nothing, and he had let it happen. He had chosen peace over his own son, chosen her comfort over my safety. And now, he had the audacity to stand there and tell me to move on, as if it was as simple as forgetting a bad dream. My father's face paled slightly, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to me like this. And then I said the words that changed everything. I told him that I knew about the affair. The room went completely still. The blood drained from my mother's face so fast, I thought she might faint. My father's entire body stiffened. The aunts and uncles who had been rolling their eyes seconds ago suddenly weren't so smug anymore. Because, for the first time, I wasn't the one lying. I looked directly at my father and told him that his little speech about forgiving cheaters wasn't just a hypothetical. That I knew, without a doubt, that my mother had been cheating on him for years. That I knew he had found out a long time ago. And that instead of confronting her, instead of leaving, instead of doing anything, he had let it happen. And worse, he had let her take it out on me. My mother stood up so fast her chair tipped over. She tried to play it off, to say that I was lying, that I was just making things up for attention. But the damage was done. The murmurs had turned into outright whispers, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. People were looking at her now, not me, because some of them already knew. I could see it in their eyes. Some of them had suspected it for years. Some of them had seen the cracks in my parents' marriage but had never said anything. Some of them had probably heard the rumors, had maybe even covered for her. But no one had ever said it out loud before. Until now. My father didn't speak. He just sat there, hands curled in a fist on the table, face blank. He had no defense. No carefully crafted speech to twist the situation in his favor. Because I had shattered the illusion. I had told the truth. And now, everyone knew. The room erupted into chaos. My mother stormed out, knocking into people on her way, her face twisted in fury. My father finally stood, looking like he wanted to chase after her. But what could he even say? The family that had once been so eager to defend them suddenly wasn't so sure anymore. Conversations broke out in hushed tones, people whispering behind their hands. And me? I felt nothing but relief. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one keeping their secrets. I grabbed my coat, stepped around my father, and walked out of the reunion without looking back. Let them deal with the fallout. I was finally free. I didn't expect the silence to last. After the explosion at the family reunion, I knew the fallout would come. My mother had stormed out in a fury. My father had been left sitting there, humiliated, and the rest of the family had been thrown into chaos. I had done what no one had ever dared to do. I had ripped apart the illusion they had so carefully crafted, exposing the rot beneath it for everyone to see. But people like my parents don't just disappear. They regroup. They rebuild the lies. They find new ways to rewrite the story until they're the victims and I'm the villain. For the first few days, there was nothing. No calls, no messages. I knew they weren't ignoring me out of shame. They were strategizing. They were figuring out how to control the narrative before it spiraled completely beyond their reach. I had exposed my mother's affair. I had shattered my father's carefully constructed facade, and I had walked out before anyone could twist my words. But I knew better than to think it was over. When my phone finally rang, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was that it wasn't my parents. It was my Aunt Linda. Of all my relatives, she was the one I had been closest to growing up. She wasn't particularly warm, but she had never gone out of her way to make my life harder like the others had. She had always watched from the sidelines, detached, never interfering, but never participating in my mother's cruelty either. When I left home, she had been one of the few who didn't judge me for it. She never defended me, but she never attacked me either. So when she called, I hesitated before answering. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, like she had rehearsed this conversation before dialing my number. She started with small talk, asking how I was, as if she hadn't been there when my entire family imploded a few nights ago. I let her talk, let her get comfortable, and then, finally, she got to the real reason she had called. She wanted to know if I would be willing to meet with my father. Not my mother, just him. I didn't respond immediately. I let the words settle, trying to figure out what angle she was playing. My father had spent my entire childhood standing silently in the background, letting my mother destroy me without ever lifting a finger to stop her. Even after I left, even after I cut contact, he had never once reached out to apologize, to explain, to offer even the slightest hint of remorse. And now, after I had humiliated him in front of the entire family, he wanted to talk. I asked her why. She hesitated. Then, in a quieter voice, she told me something I wasn't expecting. He had left my mother. I almost laughed. The idea of my father finally growing a spine and walking away from her was so absurd that for a second, I thought she was joking. But she wasn't. She told me that after the reunion, after everything I had exposed, something had shifted. My mother had gone ballistic, turning her rage on him the way she had always done to me. Only this time, there was no one else for her to direct it at. And my father? He had finally cracked. For the first time in his life, he had done something I never thought he was capable of. He left her. It wasn't clean. My mother had fought him on it, screamed at him, called him weak, pathetic. But he had packed a bag and walked out the door, cutting off communication with her completely. And now he wanted to see me. I should have said no. I should have laughed, hung up, and moved on with my life. But some part of me, the part that had spent my entire childhood begging for him to be the father I needed, hesitated. So I agreed. We met at a small diner outside of town, the kind of place where nobody knew our names, where we wouldn't run into any wandering family members. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately, sitting at a booth near the back, hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup. He looked older, not just in the way that time naturally ages a person, but in the way that guilt does. The bags under his eyes, the slight slump of his shoulders, the way he kept fidgeting with the cup, all signs of a man who had spent a lifetime running from the truth and had finally been forced to face it. For the first few minutes, we didn't speak. Then, finally, he exhaled and told me the words I had waited decades to hear. I should have protected you. I sat completely still, my hands resting on the table, my heart hammering in my chest. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to justify his silence. He just sat there, eyes downcast, voice raw, admitting what he had never been able to say before. That he had known, that he had seen everything. That every time my mother had hurt me, belittled me, twisted reality until I doubted my own memories, he had been right there, watching. And he had done nothing. He told me he had been afraid of her, that she had controlled every aspect of their lives, that she had manipulated and gaslit him just as much as she had done to me, that he had let it happen because he thought that keeping the peace was the only way to survive. I waited for anger to rise in me, for that familiar resentment to claw its way back to the surface. But all I felt was exhaustion, because I had already known. I had known my father was weak. I had known he was a coward. I had known that, for him, looking away had been easier than standing up for his own son. But hearing him say it, watching the guilt eat away at him, it didn't make me feel better. It didn't make me feel anything. He told me he wanted to fix things, that he didn't expect forgiveness, but that he wanted to try. That leaving my mother had made him realize just how much damage he had allowed to happen. That he didn't want to spend the rest of his life carrying this weight. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting his words settle, watching as he struggled to read my expression. Then I told him the truth. You don't get to ask for forgiveness just because you finally decided to leave her. His face fell, but I wasn't done. I told him that he should have left when it mattered, that the damage was already done, that he had spent my entire childhood choosing his own comfort over my safety, and no amount of regret was going to change that. And then I asked him something I had never dared to ask before. Would you have ever left her if I hadn't said anything at the reunion? He opened his mouth, then closed it, because we both knew the answer. No. Without me exposing the truth, without me tearing apart the illusion, he would have stayed. He would have let her keep destroying him the way she had destroyed me, because that's what he had always done. He wasn't brave. He was just finally scared enough to run. I stood up, tossing a few bills on the table. I told him that I didn't hate him, but I also didn't need him anymore. That if he really wanted to change, if he really wanted to fix things, it wasn't my job to make that happen. Then I walked out, and this time I didn't look back. Leaving the diner should have felt like closure. Walking away from my father, from his guilt-ridden expression and his hollow apologies, should have been the moment I finally untangled myself from the past. But as I stepped out into the cold evening air, a strange emptiness settled inside me. Not relief, not triumph, just a quiet understanding that the past doesn't vanish just because you acknowledge it. It lingers. It latches onto you in ways you don't notice until years later when you find yourself flinching at raised voices or hesitating before trusting someone. It seeps into your bones, shaping you into the kind of person who always expects the worst because expecting anything else is dangerous. For days after that meeting, my father made no attempt to reach out again. There were no messages, no calls, no pathetic attempts to cling to whatever thread of connection still remained between us. Perhaps he had understood, finally, that there was no fixing what had been broken. Or perhaps, like always, he had chosen the easier route, accepting his failure rather than fighting against it. Whatever the reason, he faded into the background as if he had never been there at all. And yet, the impact of that conversation refused to leave me. The memories resurfaced in fragments, uninvited and unwelcome, forcing me to relive moments I had spent years trying to bury. I remember the first time I realized my mother didn't love me, not in the way other mothers love their children. There was no warmth, no safety in her presence. There were only rules, expectations, punishments. The way she would test me, pushing me to my limits just to see if I would break. The way she would watch me struggle with something, a simple chore, a difficult homework assignment, waiting for the moment frustration took over, so she could tear me down for it. The way she had learned to twist words like a blade, finding weaknesses and exploiting them, ensuring that I always felt small, insignificant, unworthy. And through it all, my father had stood there, silent. He had never once raised a hand against me, never once spoken to me with the same cruelty she did. But his inaction had been just as loud as her anger. Every time he turned away, every time he muttered that I should just obey, every time he let her rip me apart without a word of protest, he had made his choice. He had chosen her. He had chosen himself. He had chosen peace over his own son. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by them, even after I left. The way I had trained myself to disappear in social situations, to take up as little space as possible because I had been conditioned to believe that my presence was an inconvenience. The way I had hesitated before expressing opinions, afraid that disagreement would lead to punishment, even though I was an adult now and no one had power over me anymore. The way I had spent years convincing myself that I didn't need love, that I was fine on my own, because opening myself up to someone meant giving them the ability to hurt me the way my mother had. I had spent so long running from them, cutting them out, distancing myself from the wreckage they had left behind. But what I hadn't realized until now was that they had never truly been gone. They had been in every fear, every hesitation, every moment of self-doubt. They had shaped me in ways I hadn't even recognized, and even with them no longer in my life, I was still carrying the weight of their ghosts. When I finally gathered the nerve to look at my phone again, I saw exactly what I had expected. My mother had left messages, long ones filled with fury disguised as righteousness. She had always known how to weave cruelty into the illusion of concern, making it seem as though she was the wounded party, the loving mother betrayed by an ungrateful son. She accused me of humiliating her, of airing private matters in front of people who had no business knowing. She claimed I had embarrassed the family, that I had painted a false picture of the past for sympathy, that I had always been the problem, never her. There was no mention of my father, no acknowledgement of his absence, no admission that he had finally walked away after years of silence. If anything, she seemed angrier at me than at him, as if I had somehow taken something from her, as if I had robbed her of control, the one thing she had always prided herself on having. She demanded that I call her, that I set things right, that I apologize for the damage I had done. But there was no remorse, no regret, no recognition of the things she had done to me. Just the same manipulation, the same entitlement, the same expectation that I would fall back in line. I didn't respond. I deleted the messages, blocked the number, and sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen, wondering if this was truly the end of it. Maybe she would keep trying. Maybe she would find another number to call from, another way to reach me, another excuse to drag me back into her world. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I didn't need to justify my decisions to her. I didn't need to explain myself to people who had never cared about me beyond what I could offer them. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I had spent years believing that if I just waited long enough, my parents would change. That one day, they would wake up and realize what they had done, that they would feel the weight of their choices and try to make things right. But now, I understood the truth. Some people don't change. Some people don't regret. Some people will never give you the apology you deserve. And that's okay, because I didn't need it anymore. I had already won. There was a strange kind of quiet after I blocked my mother's number. The weight of her messages still lingered, but for the first time, I didn't feel obligated to carry it. She had spent my entire life dictating the terms of our relationship, deciding when I was allowed to speak, when I was allowed to exist. But now, the silence wasn't hers. It was mine, and I had chosen it. For weeks, I heard nothing. No new numbers trying to reach me, no desperate emails, no sudden messages from distant relatives trying to pull me back in. It was almost unnerving. My mother had never been the type to let go of control so easily, and yet, it seemed as if she had vanished. I should have felt relieved. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Then one morning an email arrived. It wasn't from her. It was from my father. The subject line was blank. No griting, no pleasantries. Just a single paragraph, short and to the point. He told me that my mother was sick. Not the kind of sick that could be fixed, not the kind that offered second chances. It was terminal. The doctors had given her months, maybe less, and in her final days, she wanted to see me. I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over, waiting for some kind of reaction to rise within me. Anger, sadness, relief, anything. But there was nothing, just a hollow, weightless feeling, like I had stepped outside of my own body and was watching everything from a distance. There was no apology in his message, no acknowledgement of what she had done to me, just the expectation that I would come back, that I would do what was right. But right for who? For years, I had lived with the idea that maybe one day I would get closure, that there would be some final conversation where she admitted what she had done, where she looked me in the eye and said she was sorry, that maybe, in the end, she would understand the damage she had caused. But I knew better now. My mother wasn't the type to seek forgiveness. If she wanted me there, it wasn't because she had changed. It was because she wanted to rewrite the ending of the story. She wanted to ensure that in her final moments, she was still the one with power, that I would sit beside her, play the part of the dutiful son, and let her die believing that she had won. I closed the email. I didn't reply. A week later, I got another message. This time it was from my aunt. She didn't ask me to visit. She just told me that it was over. My mother was gone. I read the words, and then I moved on with my day. There was no rush of grief, no sense of loss. She had been dead to me long before her body caught up. But my father? He wasn't done. A few days later, another email arrived. This one longer, more desperate. He told me that he had made a mistake, that he had failed me, that he had spent years convincing himself that he was doing the right thing by staying quiet. He said that losing my mother had made him realize what really mattered, and that he didn't want to lose me too. He begged for a second chance. I thought about it. I thought about the years of silence, the times I had needed him and he had turned away, the times he had watched my mother tear me apart and done nothing, the times he had chosen himself over me. And then I thought about something else. If I let him back in now, what would I be forgiving? The man he was? Or the man he was trying to become? Did it matter? I closed the email and stared at the screen for a long time. And then I deleted it, because some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. And for the first time in my life, I was free.